It all began on a Saturday night that was supposed to be ordinary. I had gone out with some colleagues after work, and the plan was to just unwind, have a drink or two, and call it a night. Somewhere between laughter and conversation, I found myself drinking far more than I ever intended. That was when two people, strangers to me, struck up a conversation. Everything after that became a blur, a haze of voices, flashing lights, and broken memories. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed, the fluorescent lights above me stabbing at my eyes. A nurse explained I had been rushed into the ER after collapsing in a club bathroom. Apparently, those strangers had called for help when I was unresponsive. My head was pounding, my stomach churned, and shame began sinking in as details trickled back. What would I tell my husband? I had always prided myself on being careful, on being loyal, on being the kind of wife he could depend on. Yet somehow, I had put myself in a situation that would be impossible to explain. When my husband arrived at the hospital, I thought he would be angry but concerned. Instead, I was met with a cold, distant look. He asked a few questions, listened to the doctor's explanation, and then sat silently by the wall, his arms crossed. I tried to reach for his hand, but he pulled away. My heart sank. Something was terribly wrong. On the drive home, he barely spoke. The silence felt heavier than any words could have. Finally, when we got inside the house, I asked him what was wrong. That was when he told me he knew more than I thought. A friend of his had been at the same place that night and saw me leaving with the two strangers before I was taken to the ER. My husband's voice cracked as he asked me how I could do this to him, to us. I froze. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but what could I possibly say? I didn't remember leaving with anyone, not intentionally. I tried to tell him it was a misunderstanding, that I had no memory of anything like that happening, but the look on his face told me he had already made up his mind. He had evidence, or at least enough to convince him. In his eyes, I was guilty of betrayal. 4 days afterward, I tried to reason with him. I begged him to believe that I never cheated, that I never meant to put myself in such a situation. But the more I insisted, the more distant he became. He moved into the guest room, started spending late nights outside, and barely acknowledged me. It was like living with a ghost of the man I once knew. One evening, he sat me down and told me plainly that he was leaving. He said he couldn't trust me anymore, that even if nothing physical had happened, the fact that I allowed myself to get so careless was betrayal enough. He told me he had given his whole heart to me, and now he felt like a fool. I tried to hold his hand, but he slipped away, as if my touch burned him. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I replayed that night over and over, trying to remember exactly what happened. I tortured myself with what-ifs. What if I hadn't gone out? What if I had stopped after one drink? What if I had called him instead of those strangers? But the answers never came. All I had was a broken marriage and a deep pit of regret. I learned through mutual friends that my husband told people I cheated on him, that he caught me red-handed. That wasn't true, but I had no way to prove my innocence. The story spread, and soon I was painted as the villain who betrayed a good man. My reputation was ruined, and my heart ached knowing there was nothing I could do to change his mind. There were moments when I wanted to scream, to shout that I had been the victim of a reckless night, not an unfaithful wife. But in the silence of my home, with his belongings gone and his presence just a memory, I realized words no longer mattered. He had already closed the door on us. Slowly, I began to accept that sometimes perception matters more than truth. My husband didn't want to hear my side, didn't want to forgive, and didn't want to try again. For him, trust was shattered beyond repair. I couldn't control his choice, only my own. So I started focusing on myself, seeking therapy, and cutting back on the lifestyle that had led me into such a disastrous night. I promised myself I'd never allow alcohol or strangers to dictate my choices again. The scars of losing my marriage remained, but I had to rebuild. Sometimes I still see him in my dreams, smiling the way he used to, before everything fell apart. I wake up with tears in my eyes, wishing I could go back and undo that one night. But life doesn't give do-overs. All I can do now is carry the lesson with me. And though I may never understand fully why he left without giving me a chance to prove myself, I know one truth: love cannot survive without trust. Once it's broken, no amount of words can ever fix it. That was the real cause of our end, and it will haunt me for the rest of my life.